Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Good afternoon. Today is November 4th, Wednesday. This is the InfoMullet Live Ask Me Anything that is titled appropriately, Fuck It, We're Doing It Live. An homage to Bill O'Reilly and the reality of sort of with today, everything going on in the election, we're going to just be rolling it live. I'm Timothy Clancy, your chief mulleteer. This is Bonky, the emotional support donkey. Hope everyone's doing well on today. And obviously the topics are going to be focused on the election and what's going on. I have a few things to go over, but please ask questions, throw things in the comments. It's kind of an improvised, if whose line is it anyway, did political commentary, that's what today's episode is going to be like. So, you know, throw some things out there, add in the chats. If you haven't yet, like, follow, or share the video. Share it out to people. I am going to be trying to, you know, provide some fun and humor, but also informative context. I see a lot of questions going on processes, so I'm going to focus on that a lot. So if you have people on your feed who have those questions, or you want to save yourself from typing out a bunch of stuff, link this video in. And as always, we really appreciate our Patreon subscribers. So if you haven't yet, or if you've been thinking about it, check out www.patreon.com/infomullet. Become a mulleteer subscriber. It's only $5 a month. A senior mulleteer is $10 a month. We've got a great group of mulleteers. I see a lot of them here in the comments. So join the crowd. It helps us bring more context to the news, especially in times like this, where there's so many questions and there's so many opinions, and what we really need is context. So I'm going to do what I can. So starting off, obviously, with the presidential election, kind of walking through this, you know, we've done so many episodes leading up to this of different things. I want to walk through some things that were good leading up to it, and then where we go from here. I will also include the InfoMullet forecast. See, unlike all those other forecasters who spend millions of dollars forecasting things well in advance, I am sitting back until the day after the election and I'll forecast the final result. But first off, I think one of the things we have to take a step back and think of is this is probably going to be one of the highest participation votes in modern history. I don't know what the final numbers are going to be. I think 1973 was the last big one, percentage-wise. This is going to be a monster turnout election. And it's interesting to me, having observed these elections going back. I mean, I was that kid who was a nerd even in like 1980 watching political elections on TV. How limited in terms of instability, violence, you know, vote suppression, all the things we're used to seeing in elections. It's not that they were zero. There was very little violence, very little instability. I mean, even voting suppression, a couple of the groups I follow that are civil rights groups, they monitor elections, they were even saying that what they characterized as the problems were sporadic and limited. And I think that's a really important thing to sit back, is we just held perhaps one of the most contentious 6-month periods going into a national election that this country has seen for a long time, set in the backdrop of a major pandemic, set in the backdrop of large protests and rallies and riots that have gone on for months, set in the backdrop of definitely in heated rhetoric on the part of at least President Trump. And yet the election itself appears to have gone very, very smoothly. Now, we can say that was in part because a lot of these mail-in ballots, that reduces the pressure on people going to the polls. It may create opportunity for people who couldn't vote in person to vote. They're not therefore overwhelming the polls, so the lines move faster, things like that. But I think it's really important to sort of at least recognize that what we've had is a watershed election where a lot of things, just like everything else with COVID, we said, oh, you know, we can't do that. This year, we proved we can do an election that's a large amount of election and not have it descend into violence and chaos and all these things. And I think a lot of that has to do with the mail-in ballot, which is probably COVID related, but something to keep going forward, that we keep these in mind. So where do we stand? Right now, it's a contested election between Biden and Trump as to who has more votes. I'm going to go ahead and make a presidential election forecast. So if you don't like spoiler alerts, if you don't want to, like, if you want to stay hanging on your seats, I am going to call that, and I'll explain why in a second, but I'm calling right now that Biden flips Arizona, he keeps Nevada, takes Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And the question mark for me is whether or not Georgia flips, which is a remarkable statement that here we are. You know, there was a lot of estimates that Biden would have a blowout, that he might be plus 200 electorals. That was my forecast, is that he might, you know, looking at the bell curve, that he would have a blowout. Clearly, he hasn't had a blowout. It's a lot closer. But I think at the end of the day, he's going to have 290 to 306 electoral votes, depending on which way Georgia goes. And I'm going to go through why that is here as we go through some of the states and these specific results. But I think that's my forecast for where we're going to end up. And part of that is, let's talk about process, right? As we've said in the past, there is no federal mandate when it comes to these elections. Every single state runs its elections in its own way and its own rules. And this is really important. When a presidential candidate comes out and says, we're going to stop the vote, or we're going to take it to a legal challenge to stop the vote, every state has rules that have been in place for a long time of how you handle mail-in ballots. And every single state has a process by which you do the voting on a certain day, it ends at that day. Any mail-in ballots typically can't be counted until the day of the live voting. So people are kind of wondering, well, why are all these mail-in ballots, you know, just being counted now? By state law, most mail-in ballots can't be counted, and it varies by state, but certainly in the states we're looking at, most of the states that Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, they didn't start counting the mail-in ballots until yesterday. Some states have rules that you don't even count mail-in ballots unless it's going to have a demonstrable difference on the outcome. Now, I think in this case that's true. And even further, mail-in ballots are trickier to count than automated machines. So all of these coming together means we had a very unique election where the results between live polling and mail-in balloting were going to create these kind of swings we're seeing, and these kind of shifting back and forth. You know, Biden was leading for a while in Ohio, and then it flipped to Trump, and he ran away with it. Conversely, in Wisconsin, Trump was leading, and then it flipped to Biden. So you see these kind of flips back and forth. And I think why I'm calling the forecast the way I am, and I'll go through it, is most of these states, they've counted the live votes, but what remains is the mail-in ballots. And at least the belief is that the mail-in ballots will heavily favor the Democratic contender, because there was the big push by the Democrats to encourage mail-in balloting, to participate in it. They tended to be more concerned about the pandemic, therefore not going to the polls. And obviously on the Republican side, a lot of Republicans were actually trying to encourage mail-in balloting. If you were in anywhere, you probably got mailers from Republican party that said, yeah, please do mail-in ballots, please register, please get on there. But the president himself was really discouraging the mail-in ballot. Now, we could be surprised. This is an unusual election. We don't have a lot of data when there's this many mail-in ballots of who it favors, but my forecast is based in that the live votes are mostly counted and what's left is the mail-in ballot. So let's go through actually how this is going to roll out in the rest of the week. Because 2 weeks ago, I made a forecast that we were going to know probably no later than Friday of the election week who was the winner previous to recounts and challenges and all that. And I think that still holds true. I don't think we're going to know from these votes. Let's walk through them. Arizona right now, last I checked, Biden had a 3-point lead. 86% of the vote has been reported. All of its in-person ballots for Maricopa County, that's where Phoenix is, have been counted. So there's not a lot of in-person ballots left to count. That gets it to the mail-in ballot. I assume that tends to favor Biden. I think he holds the lead. Nevada, very slight lead by Biden, but again, all in-person votes have been counted. That means all that's left of these late ballots are going to be mail-in ballots, and my presumption, my mental model is those will favor Biden, and therefore the slight lead he has, he'll be able to maintain. Wisconsin, so that's Arizona, Nevada. Arizona's a flip. It's been a GOP stronghold for a while. So that's a change in the state on the electoral map for Biden. And that's important because not many states change this election. There's only a few that were in play. In Wisconsin, all votes, mail-in and live, have been counted according to the state commissioner of election, the state secretary of state, state elections commission. I've said all votes have been counted. Biden's ahead by about 21,000 votes. Now that doesn't sound like much. That's like, oh, they're going to do a recount and that may all go up in the air. Wisconsin has had recounts recently. They've had 2 of them prominently. And every time they do a statewide recount, the number of votes that change, it's like 300. So a 20, I mean, Wisconsin, you got to give props. They're pretty competent in their voting. So when you go and do the rules are very tight about what constitutes a change. So when you look at a lead like 20,000 votes, even if there was a recount challenge, it's very unlikely that there would be enough votes of those 20,000 that would get changed to make the difference. It might be 400 votes, 500 votes. Maybe you double previous recounts at 600 votes because you're saying, okay, things are unusual. Nowhere near enough to flip it. Georgia, surprising me, Georgia has remained tight. Earlier in the we're looking at Texas and Florida and all these ones about, are the Democrats going to flip them? It didn't happen. But Georgia has been approaching a blue flip for a couple elections now, and all the remaining votes are in the Atlanta metro area. And this is, if you've ever watched Georgia politics, it's like every freaking election DeKalb County's late. This is not unusual. It's often a couple days. A lot of times it doesn't matter. But you're talking about here of DeKalb County, Fulton County, Cobb County, Gwinnett County. These are the greater metro area, and that's where a lot of blue votes are. But they're saying that they're going to expect the votes to be tallied later today. That's the Secretary of State. I think that's optimistic. Georgia has a history of saying, yes, we will get all the votes tallied the day after the election and then missing that deadline. But I think we're going to know by the end of the day. And I would not be surprised if Georgia goes blue by a small margin. It may not happen. I think that's the outlier. If that happens, that would be a major flip. And really, Arizona and Georgia would be the only two states that have flipped from a traditional alignment that's not, a battleground state. Speaking of battleground states, you hear a lot about the blue wall. As of the last time I checked, Michigan, Biden holds a narrow lead. It's under a percentage point, but there's still tens of thousands of ballots, but most of those are mail-in votes in Wayne County, Detroit. That's Democratic stronghold. So again, you're seeing this dynamic in a lot of states where all the live ballots are counted. Trump ran up the score as much as he could, but what's remaining in count is the mail-in ballots that they couldn't begin counting until yesterday, sometimes even yesterday night, and those tend to be heavily focused in Democratic areas. Therefore, if Biden has a lead before that count even starts, I assume he's going to maintain it or advance it. Pennsylvania, this is the one that's a little tricky. It's a little bit more loosey-goosey. Trump is actually ahead by 9 points right now. So there's a significant gap, but this is a state where there's actually live votes that haven't been counted and mail-in votes. So this is a state with only 80% of the ballots counted yet. That means there's millions of ballots left, and it all falls on where they're going to fall and whether they're going to be in Philadelphia or the color around the suburbs. Where are those votes concentrated? I think where they're concentrated, they're in a more heavily Democratic area. So I could be surprised. Biden could lose Pennsylvania, but if he holds on to Arizona, takes Nevada, he really only needs was 2 of the 3 blue firewall states, and he has the election. That's why I'm forecasting Biden's going to win the election 290 to 306, or 290 to 306 will be his margin over Trump. So let me pause here and catch up on any questions. That's the state of play of the election right now. I think we're going to know, if not tonight, no later than Friday. There will be, this is before recounts and legal challenges. We'll get into that later, but I think we're going to know pretty good picture of where we are leading into those by later tonight or Friday at latest. Let's see. So saying hello to some folks. Charles, good to see you. Sarah, Mike, welcome. Mike, Barbara, Derek, Jennifer, good to see you. Oh, John Scott, great to see you. Albert and Jeremy. Yeah, so let's go through some of these comments these people make. First one is Jerry. So Maine is doing ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is a concept. Well, let me pause that to when we get to the Senate elections, because that will have more of an impact in the Senate elections. Charles mentioning that South Dakota legalized pot. Again, the march of marijuana legalization is just going to continue on, I think. Jennifer Segev is saying mail-in ballots in Nevada so far by registration party is 50% Democrat, 25% Republican, 25% other. That phase. Full disclosure, I vote in Nevada, so I did my absentee ballot weeks ago. I'm in that 25% other. I voted for Biden. Shock, surprise. Yeah, so John's mentioning Trump's campaign will call for a recount in Wisconsin. I suspect any of these places where you can get an official recount, they're going to call for it. The key is that state's history of change ballots. With 20,000 lead in Wisconsin, I don't think a recount's going to change it there. Jeremy, good to see you. Albert. Okay, so this is where I wanted to get. So here we are, Tuesday and Thursday. There are Tuesday through Friday. Or Wednesday. What day is it today? It's Wednesday. So here we are, Wednesday through Friday. I think we're going to know either tonight or by Friday. So Jeremy asked this question: how do I see instability going forward? Well, the good news is it's a cold, rainy weekend forecast for Portland this weekend. So it's low 40s and 30s and raining, and it's kind of a joke. But you know, if you want to know a specific area for instability this weekend, when I did my instability forecast, I said there was a probability for protest, riots, rallies, the same kind of stuff we've seen over the last 8 months in this first weekend after the election is probably the highest risk. So if you want a really easy way to check if your area or any specific area is going to do that, check out weather.com. Go look at the forecast Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You know, people like going out and being rebellious, speaking their mind, protesting, striking it to the man, whatever, red and blue alike, they like it in hot, dry weather. If you're wearing a poncho and you got cold water dripping from your nose and it's not quite snowing, but it'd actually be warmer if it was snowing, that's very hard to sustain protest movements, and that's miserable conditions. And so the weather factor is playing a role here. I think the colder it is, the wetter it is, the less we're going to see action. Now, obviously, the people are like, well, wait a minute, what about everyone inciting everyone and all the statements and all that? I think, you know, I did my forecast multiple times now, first for the beginning of the year, for the entire year. The demographics of the United States population do not support the kind of conditions. Think of this like a garden. In terms of like mass instability growing in this garden, we don't have the right soil, we got lots of rocks, it's not the right composition. The demographic factors are not in favor of mass instability. Now, onto that, someone's going to plant some seeds and try and incite people to do that. Well, remember what I said at the top of the show. We just had the largest participation election in history, or not in history, in modern history, during a pandemic, with shutdowns, with everything that's going on, and no violence or instability up through the election itself. That's a really key indicator. You're talking about momentum here. You know, if you were going to do something symbolically, that election day is the day to do it. That's the symbolic. All eyes are on. If you're going to do something now, you know, you're going to try and make a statement or do something. You're talking about local coverage. Social media will jump in. You know, it'll be the normal stuff. But it's not. It's hard to. There's no focusing point right now until we get into recounts and legal challenges. If this gets into like legal challenges and recounts, those provide focus areas that you could target if you wanted to target instability. But what are you going to do with instability right now as opposed to just going into your neighborhood streets and saying, I'm really mad loudly? There's not really good opportunities to target. I do still believe that regardless of how this election goes in the next week, we are at high risk of clandestine terror groups forming. That's much more likely. Groups like that domestic terror group and the Michigan militia and groups like that are radicalizing because they don't like the results, or they're not happy with the results, or they don't like what's going on or whatever, that remains a risk. But mass population instability, the demographic conditions aren't good. We're in a cold area. People are nervous about COVID, and there's no focusing points to target. There's no, you know, symbolic heart and center you could aim for like you could on election day. So again, I'm not saying there's not going to be there's no protest rallies, riots, but we've been dealing with that for 8 months. So we may see some of the same for a week or two. But, you know, I'm going to talk about Ethiopia later today, where you had, you know, an armed group gather 200 people, line them up and shoot them, you know, and you've got, you know, the Vienna terror attack that had about 30 casualties between killed and wounded. You have, you know, incidents like that. I don't think we're going to have a whole lot. So let's pause here. Once again, if you're joining, feel free to share this. It's loosey-goosey. We're going on audience questions, and so I'll be kind of making it up as we go along. That's the purpose of the day. Yeah, Lisa says the idea of clandestine terror groups are scarier. That's fair. That's the threat of the unknown. You don't see it. It could be out there. It might not. You don't know. until it happens. And that is a legitimately scary activity, threat to confront, but it tends to be much less damaging on the large scale, macro scale, than mass violence and instability. So it's kind of a way you're pick your poison. I also don't think, there's this whole dynamic, and I may get into this a little bit more, but I want to touch on it now. The whole dynamic shifts in this entire political landscape if President Trump is going to remain president or it looks like he's not going to be president. There is, and I'm not saying that to pick just on Trump, because, I could say, well, if Biden's president or not president, like, what's that mean? But what I'm saying is, within the president's supporters, there's the true believers that are committed, but there's a whole constellation of folks that are kind of engaged in the Faustian bargain that, and I literally called this the Faustian bargain very early on in the administration. They were going to tolerate the president's actions, his breaking of norms, the kind of things that you would think Republicans would be against. They were going to tolerate it as long as they got Supreme Court nominees. I think with the confirmation of Barrett, that's the last part of the bargain. They've got what they got, and they're willing to cut him loose. Even with his comments last night that we should stop the voting and stop now, a lot of Republicans were willing to come out and say, basically, shut up, just stop saying that. And a lot more were saying it privately. So if it looks like he's going to win, you're going to see the same damping effect where the GOP is not willing to hold him accountable. But if it looks like he's losing, I think the Republicans themselves are going to try and cut their losses. That doesn't mean there's not a risk of his true believers and supporters, but I think it's marginal. So let's talk real first about Senate. So Senate outcome, it's going to be split. It's going to be the wave that was looking to, for the Democrats to take the Senate, Biden had to score in that 200 plus electoral range. You're talking electoral college score of 400, high 300s. Not happening. So, think about it this way. Of all the states that were out there, the battleground states, the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that have gone back and forth, those are still obviously very important. Other than that, the only states that flipped, I think, are Arizona and possibly Georgia. And I say flip from a long-term trend of where they were going. And, one thing with elections is the top of the ballot tends to dominate the bottom of the ballot. So if you had flipped Texas, if Texas had gone blue, if you had seen wave where North Carolina goes blue or South Carolina goes blue, you had Senate races in North Carolina, South Carolina, those are still going to go to the Republicans. I don't think the Democrats pick up enough. It's going to be a very narrow split chamber with the Republicans still having a slight control. But again, I want to touch on this dynamic. What happens in a scenario where there's a President Biden who himself has spent his entire career working in the Senate, knows how it works, knows how it operates, and a Republican-controlled Senate that itself sort of has said, well, there's no Faustian bargain left. We can't get any more Supreme Court nominations that, we're not going to get any more that we want. And Trump's out of the picture. That changed the dynamic. Most of the senators were running scared from primary challenges from Trump supporters. And a big question comes to how much that changes, if anything, the dynamic. It may not change anything. It may be obstructionism from here on out. But let's keep in mind, the U.S. election processes are not a game that it ends on election day. It's a continuum. And I'm already thinking, and I know people are going to groan, 2022, midterms, right? The question I have in my mind is the blue wave that was expected to manifest now, is that going to take place over 2 years where we see a midterm gain because Trump is, if Trump loses, this is a hypothetical based on Trump losing, we don't know that yet, it's my forecast, but I just want to be cautious here. If Trump loses and he's not anchoring the races in 2022, the question is it a referendum on President Biden, whatever the Democratic parties have done up to that point, or is it still a lingering referendum on Trump himself? And that gets to energy and mobilization. And the question is, if you're a Trump supporter and your guy lost, right? Trump loses, and there's no way to reelect him in 2022. Are you going to still come out, vote, and be energized? Or if you're a Democratic supporter, or you're just super fired up on Trump because you've got this 4-year angst building up, is that going to sustain to 2022? So I think there's a really big question when it comes to the Senate. 2022 is the year to watch in the midterms, and it's going to be based off this tug and pull again, assuming Biden wins, this tug and pull balance between what goes on in the first 2 years of the is it still a referendum on Trump in 2022, or is it now a referendum on Biden? And we've had, whenever it's a referendum on the incumbent in midterms, you tend to see flips. It happened in 2010. It happened again in 2018, where the incumbent president is not well liked. The midterms are an opportunity. But if it's still a referendum on Trump in 2022, which is a possibility, you're going to have all sorts of investigations. You're going to have more tell-all books, documents are going to be produced. It may still be a referendum on Trump in 2022. And that's where I see the risk for the GOP of a collapse in support, which didn't manifest now. So, take it with a grain of salt. What do I know? Some questions. Albert saying, can the GOP recover from Trump? Do they even seem to need to? Albert, that gets kind of to what I was talking about. In the next 2 years, you're going to see whether in some ways, if Biden wins, still a forecast, I'm proposing it, but if Biden wins, you're going to see a choice in the GOP. Do we run away from Trump because we got the Supreme Court that we wanted and we need to salvage the party, or are we going to stay with him? And it's tough because Trump has elected a lot of supporters into the House of Representatives, less into the Senate, but there's some there. And the question that, can the GOP recover? In a way, they've gotten a gift. They haven't collapsed yet. They still have a ruling majority in the Senate, at least, and they've held the line on these states. If they're still associated with the party of Trump in midterms, where Trump, no matter how you run it, is not on the ballot, I think they get shellacked. If they run away from him and they can do a contrast with the Democrats, or maybe we return, let me joke here too, normal order, where the Senate is operating under normal order again. Okay, everyone laugh. Maybe they get to do something. I don't know. John's pointing out too, the DNC seems to have no idea how to speak to rural voters. Thoughts on what they could do to disrupt that GOP stronghold in future elections? This is the opposite side of Albert's question. Albert says, what can the GOP do to recover? John's looking at the DNC. I think where the DNC has been strongest, this turns, apologies for the fuzziness. Every time I lean forward, it changes it. But where the DNC has been strongest, it's been on these sort of, and I know there's this tug, the progressives believe if we're just more progressive, if we're just more radical in what we do, we'll energize the votes, we'll get more. That does not seem to hold water. Causally speaking, the primaries on the Democratic primary, they couldn't manifest the progressive base to pick from several strong progressive candidates that you could take your pick of which one you wanted. They simply didn't materialize. Likewise, where Biden lost, it was in areas that weren't subject to progressive swings. You talk about the loss in Florida, and you have the Cuban American population that is pulled very strongly for Trump. That's not something that a more energized progressive base is going to necessarily flip. You might get, you've got California, New York, the urban areas like Atlanta, all these urban cities, they're already fairly progressive, but it's the areas in the suburbs and the rural areas where you're going to see this dynamic. So what can the DNC shift? Just return to competent government. I mean, in some ways, bring the character back to a president where the president's not on Twitter 24 hours a day, not saying stuff that makes you look like you just drank rat poison when you say you have to support him. Pull on the character side for Biden, focus on the economy, focus on the pandemic, focus on bread and butter issues, focus on those things. Now, of course, bread and butter means stimulus, right? What happens to stimulus, the second stimulus for the pandemic? Medicare for all. These are valid bread and butter issues. These are kitchen table issues. But the way it's presented, I think, to the DNC, they have a chance to make an argument. They've got the opportunity, and they're gonna have to make that argument if they want to move into those inroads in those more rural areas. But key to look, everything I've seen is that in the rural areas, Trump underperformed in 2020 relative to 2016, and Biden overperformed. Now, this is key. That doesn't mean Biden won rural areas, but if Trump had won a rural area by 20 points in 2016, maybe he only won it by 10 or 15. And that difference of reducing that margin in areas that are going to run up for the conservative candidate is the difference often in winning an election. Likewise, the reverse in the urban. If you can expand your lead in the urban. So it's got to be, I think what's coming out of this election is there's no real areas you can ignore. Because if you just, what Trump proved in 2016 is if you just focus on the urban areas, he can run away with the rural areas and get so much lead there that he cuts into the urban. Where Biden is winning right now, I think, is the fact that he was able to decrease that margin while still being effective in the urban areas. So let's talk about the Senate. This gets to Maine, and Jerry's chomping at the bit here for the ranked choice voting. Maine has ranked choice voting, and it's actually going to matter potentially. Ranked choice voting is where when you go in to vote, rather than picking my candidate is Bob or Mary and that's it, you get to rank the candidates you pick by preference. And what that means is if the first candidate, if there is no candidate who gets a majority, then it goes to, it reshuffles. Basically, if no one's first pick gets a majority, it starts looking on these ranks and finding who gets a majority. And it's done automatically. You don't have to go in and do a second vote. It's all based on the thing. There is a scenario, and it's on the Senate race there. If no one wins a majority, because there's a belief that and this is all new, first time out, ranked choice voting, people can put independents, they can put third-party candidates, they can put it at the top, knowing that if there is a runoff, because it's close, then their second vote is they're kind of like, they're putting the person they want to date at the top and the person they want to marry at second. You may see a reordering of the votes in ranked choice voting, and it could flip the lead in the Senate right now, which is going to Republican. So I'm seeing here, yeah, questions about 2022. If I haven't answered any of the 22 midterms, I want to pause here too. A big area that's not being looked at that I think is absolutely vital for this election, and it's going to take us a while to figure it out, is the state legislature races, right? When you think about, so there's everyone's like federal, Senate, House, President, got it, federal. But every state has one or two chambers and the governor. And what the term is if your party controls the both chambers of the legislature and the governor, that's called the trifecta. And that's basically dominant party control of the state. The reason these matter a lot this election, specifically, 2020 is the year of the census. That means whoever wins these state legislatures are going to be the ones that are in charge of redistricting based off census results. You only get to draw district lines once every 10 years alongside the census. And these can be huge opportunities for all sorts of shenanigans. I mean, the Republicans went all out to draw lines and boundaries. The concept is called gerrymandering. You draw a district with one of those funny lines and you try and pack it with your folks or split up the votes of the opponents so they can't be effective. Personally, as a radical moderate, one of the tenets of the radical moderate is House races should not have districts anymore. The district should be the state and it should be voted parliamentary. Just get rid of districts altogether. There's some challenges that with minority majority voting rules. But yeah, when you have in 2020, these state legislatures are going to have the opportunity to draw the districts that will determine races all the way through 2030. And when we walked into this, there was a Republican majority. So there's 99 chambers. I think 60 of them had a Republican majority, 39. And the key thing is this trifecta, right? The trifecta, going into 2020, there were 36 trifecta states, 21 Republican and 15 Democrat. And that's an improvement. That's a huge change, because one of my biggest concerns in 2016 and 2018 is the Republicans had, I think, 30 trifecta states. And I was honestly worried that they were going to call a state-based constitutional convention, because if you have 32 states, you can call a constitutional convention. That changed significantly in 2016, 2018, or excuse me, in 2018, the midterms, you began seeing the Democrats claw back some of those trifectas. So going in, 15 Democratic-controlled states, 21 Republican, and the question is, what's going to happen to these sort of, there's 24 battleground trifectas that are legislative areas that are in play. And the question is, how are those going to play out? Now, these races, they're small. Fort Swampy Nobody is a state legislator elected from Podunk County anywhere. And who knows that and who follows that? So it's going to take a while. And very few major news sources follow it closely, so it's hard to get information. But keep an eye out. We're not going to know the state legislatures probably till the end of next week, but by next week, I'll probably make some charts and things together. If you want to be savvy of what's going to happen in the next 10 years, watch the state legislatures, see who wins those and what changes from how we were before. So question here about ranked choice voting and for electoral college votes. Maine, so Mike brings up a good thing. So people tend to think that the electoral college has to be all or nothing in any state. This is one of my pet peeves when it comes to discussions about the electoral college. The Constitution is ambiguous. A state can determine how its electoral college votes, and there's 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that actually allocate their electoral college votes based on districts. And so they look at the district, and that means they're split. And this is actually, to me, one of the reforms I would think I'd be okay with the electoral college is all states should do this proportional electoral college allocation, because in so many states, the electoral college vote result is like, it's all or nothing. But the reality is it's 70-30. On these states that are sort of lopsided, it might be 80-20, but that's still 20% of the population that's not getting represented. On battleground states, you're talking Wisconsin, Michigan, they're very close. If you allocated electoral college votes by districts or by vote percentage, but you did it proportionally, you'd change the map overnight. Specific to Michael's question, though, Maine uses ranked choice voting. That is not going to come in play unless in that district. So Maine is not allocating its electoral college votes by proportions of the population. It's looking at a district and saying who won the majority of presidential votes in that district, they get that electoral college vote. My understanding is only if they don't exceed that 50% majority in that district will ranked choice voting occur, and then only it will occur in that district. It won't. So if one district has that criteria, it won't cascade and affect other districts. And again, these only apply, this ranked choice voting only applies in Maine, and the only 2 states that do these proportional allocations are Maine and Nebraska. Jan's asking, Jan Soitino, great question. Don't we see here a more general divide than we saw already for Brexit, cities versus rural? I would agree with that. It's really interesting to me. And of course, it all comes down to there's huge anchor effects on people. I've always voted Republican. I'm not going to vote for those Democrats, or it'll be a cold day in hell before I vote for Republican. That's a factor. So that's a baseline. That most people are going to vote what they voted in the past. But there's been this question of rural versus city. And what's interesting to me is that between Trump's abhorrent behavior, let's just call it what it is, and Biden's warm tapioca sort of their approach, you see these world equations begin to change. And I'm not saying Biden's gone out and delivered like the blockbuster speech that convinced people to rise up. He's just kind of like, he's there. He's not that guy over there that's really, that makes me upset. But he's managed to change that dynamic a bit. And again, bring the rural areas. You got to be careful that we're talking margins. It's not that he's suddenly changed rural areas blue, but he's made it more competitive by a little bit. And by doing that, he relieves pressure that it has to be an urban versus rural. And anytime you can see parties that can appeal broadly, you talk about a broad-based coalition, a big tent. It's not just the ideas within one sphere that only apply to cities. It would be a big tent who can effectively attract to both rural voters and urban voters. And I think we see an opening and this is all going to be statted to death by people far more equipped than me in the next couple of weeks of like, here's the map of all this stuff. I think you're going to see a little bit more dynamics, but it's hard to tell. This election is so different. You got the pandemic, you have the personality of Trump and his behavior, you've got Biden to consider. One of these things with complex systems is you can never repeat the same experiment twice. Come 2022 or 2024, might be completely different scenarios. Never know. Good. So let's see, go through, check for other questions, and I'll jump on to. If you haven't yet, like, follow, share the video. This is the Info Mullet. We do this every 2 weeks. First Wednesday of the month tends to be focused more on domestic issues, national affairs, things like that. Second of the month tends to be more focused on COVID. I am not downplaying COVID. We hit a new high on election day. Not good news. So I'm not downplaying COVID or anything like that. That's still going to be, regardless of who wins the election, we are in a bad future. I remain very cynical for COVID. So, but that will be covered more in the third week of the month, third Wednesday. So no immediate questions now. Let me jump here to see. Okay, let's talk some media literacy. So these forecast models and calling election results. First of all, I went to bed early last night. I did not stay up late watching everything because I knew that you've got these variables. This is, as I've said before, this is an unusual election, right? You have mail-in balloting of a huge amount that we've never seen before. You have the pandemic. You have all these factors that make forecasting elections really tricky. You know, you could forecast a model based off traditional demographics and voting patterns, but it's hard to forecast suppression efforts if they do or don't happen. Turns out they didn't happen much. But all these forecast models, people tend to, as humans, you know, you got to think of it like a gamer. When 538 says Biden has, and people read it as 90% chance of winning, they're not saying 90%, right? That's saying that there is a table of results, that there's 100 results in the table. Think of the wandering monster table in D&D, right? A 538 forecast that says a wandering politician or a wandering presidential election, roll D100. Every single one of those entries is just one number. And what that number represents is a different model of an electoral college outcome based off a state configuration. And if you take 100 of those forecasts and you lay them out in a table, I think it actually represents something like 40,000 permutations. So there's a brute force effort behind it, 40,000 permutations. They say, here's the 100 most common outcomes. We lay them down 1 through 100. Don't think of that as 90%. Think of it as 90 of the entries on those table represent a configuration where Biden wins the presidency. 10 of them represent a configuration where Trump wins the presidency. And there's a bell curve of where these electoral results fall. And you know, the wide part of the Biden bell curve was 200. That's going to be off, but it was well within range to be in the margin we're in now. It wasn't like, and I almost guarantee that when this is all said and done, one of the configurations that 538 said, this is one of those 100 configurations, is the one we're going to end up with. I mean, that seems like self-evident, like, okay, you got 100 shots. How hard is that? But it's actually combinatorics, 50 states plus the districts. There's a lot more potential permutations out there than just 100. So these forecasts that are being made, that led into an expectation. And then I think some media organizations really did a disservice last night. And I'm looking at you, Political, and NPR, because you were the two I caught doing it. They were calling states absurdly early in the night. They were calling Virginia for Biden while Trump was ahead and something like 60% of the votes are in. Now, I've seen arguments online that, like, well, you could estimate what votes were being tabulated in what counties, and then you can go historically. And this is kind of what happened in 2016. I mean, that's a valid method if everyone's voting in person. Not everyone's voting in person. We know that. We know there's a lot of mail-in ballots. So even if you're looking at polling and what counties are reporting, there's still this huge bundle of mail-in ballots. Now, happens to be that Virginia was right, but these early calls by some of these organizations at very low percent of voter turnouts, I think were a methodological mistake. They may have gotten lucky, gotten it right, sure, pat yourself on the back, but the organizations I respected were the ones that wouldn't call a state until they had a 95% confidence in their model and a lot of results were in. And the two ones that I've seen have done the best on this, 538 and CNN, specifically John King on CNN. He's my favorite. I didn't watch last night, but if people have asked me, if you ever want to watch an election coverage and know what's going on in detail, just watch John King. You can mute everyone else in that Brady Bunch analyst box thing, or, you know, Wolf Blitzer, the Demilich, you know, you don't have to pay attention to them, but John King knows what he's doing, and he's got a great access to the county. But both on CNN and 538, they were very hesitant to call races. I think in this environment, with the heated rhetoric, that's the right thing to do. Media literacy, shame on you, NPR, shame on you, Political, for calling races so early. I think that was the wrong move. Yeah, people are commenting 1d20 crit fail on a wonder. Yeah, ask a gamer. You know, people are like, how could 538 be so wrong? And then ask them, have you ever rolled a crit fail when you really needed it? And they're like, oh yeah, seems like all the time. Well, that's what we're talking about. 90% Biden win doesn't mean Trump doesn't win. It means 90 times out of 100 scenarios, Biden has the right configuration. And I think when it comes to these forecasts also, we're seeing that the forecasts were right in the sense that Biden had more of a buffer going into the election. These national poll averages, these state poll averages, they had more of a buffer going into the election and more pathways to win, so that even as Trump ate it up, and you know, how did Trump eat it up? How did Trump recover this? I almost guarantee it goes back to those rallies. The rallies are what, and this is why Trump wanted to get out of the White House, back on the road when he had the COVID. I am not praising his response to his COVID sickness at all. I think it was wrong. But from a purely neutral standpoint, Trump wins when he can rally. He gets in these rallies, he gets his base energized, and it's all about activation. The Biden campaign made a strategic decision very early on not to go knock on doors because of pandemic. And so you had this good compare contrast between a campaign that was all in on person-to-person contact, perhaps dangerously so, because there's some studies that, you've had so many additional deaths on cities with Trump rallies. I'm not sure how valid those are, but it's at least making the argument. And you have a campaign that is very remote, very distanced, during the pandemic. And I think Trump ran up the score when he was able to use these rallies and do it. But the buffer that Biden had over Clinton going into these elections, the pathways that they had more room to lose. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Trump's going to win this and it will do it, but I'm sticking with my forecast that Biden flips Arizona, keeps Nevada, he takes the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and possibly flips Georgia. I'm going to be interested if Georgia flips. That's going to be the key. But that's, you talk about an election, the only two states that flip from their traditional that aren't battlegrounds, Arizona, possibly Georgia. The cat got the dice again. Yeah, people quoting aliens. Why don't you put her in charge? Game over, man. Game over. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm doing for these forecasts and the media literacy. If you've got more questions on the election, go ahead and jump in, pop them. Quick diversion to foreign affairs. There's some things going on that are worth commenting on. Ethiopia, we profiled Ethiopia several months ago with a flare-up in ethnic violence. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this because it's a very complicated situation and it's easy to get things wrong. And I'm not working on notes here. I'm doing this off the top of my head. But Ethiopia, a couple months ago, they had a very famous music celebrity who was assassinated, and part of the Oromo, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, the Oromo ethnographic group, which has had a lot of contention in the past. That led to a wave of repressions against the Oromo when they were trying to do funeral stuff like that. The Oromo are not necessarily unarmed, helpless people in this. They have an armed group that is split off from the political party, the Oromo resistance group, basically. And I don't know the names. I think it's like the OLF is the Oromo Liberation Front, and the OLA is the Oromo Liberation Army, and they have split. One, it's kind of like Sinn Féin and IRA. One is the political group and one is the armed group, and they have split. The armed group actually conducted a ethnic attack where the military pulled out for reasons that I'll describe in a second. The military pulled out of an area, leaving a vulnerable population there. The Oromo armed groups came in, gathered 200 people, shot 50 of them. I mean, it was just a massacre. And that has obviously dramatically escalated tensions. Also in the Tigray region, you have another challenge for the prime minister in that there's a separatist government that held it. This is for those of you familiar with what's been going on in Spain with the Catalan separatist movements and the sort of the self-appointed elections. Very similar in Ethiopia. You have a region that wants to be autonomous, wants to be separate. They held their own elections, not lawful, but they held them. They have their own parliament. And this group has authorized the, kind of a military force, and they've begun taking military assets. It'd be kind of the equivalent if, like, a U.S. state decided to secede and started taking federal armed munitions from federal bases. Well, Ethiopia is not going to stand for that. The prime minister declared a state of emergency, has sent in armed troops, but there's a question of, are the troops defecting to that local region or not? So there's a lot of mixing things going on in Ethiopia right now, and there's a real risk of a continuing ethnic conflict there that would spiral out of control. It's had history in the past, last 20 years, especially around elections, more so first decade of the century, a little bit up to 2012, with mass violence and instability. When I talk mass violence and instability around elections, look at Ethiopia's history and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's night and day difference. There's no comparison to what we're experiencing here. There's a risk of this situation spiraling out and we get a repeat of that, and that's kind of concerning. Second thing I wanted to bring up is the Vienna attack. It's still within the razor period of 72 hours, but this was a ISIS related terror attack in Vienna, Austria. The context of this is that like a lot of other places in Europe, Austria has had spiking COVID infections in wave 2. they were going to announce a lockdown, or they had announced a lockdown. They were going to go into a lockdown that evening at like midnight. So everyone's out doing the, hey, despite there being COVID, let's go out and have one last social thing before the lockdown. I don't know. But unfortunately, there was a complex attack, and it involved the shooter who went into the Maine district area and just began rampage shooting. Last I heard, 4 or 5 people were killed, another 22 injured. So you're looking 30 casualties overall. As I suspected, when you have these rampage shootings, you have a rampage shooting is a one or more shooters moving as they're shooting, and not just like moving through a school, but moving through locations. Initially, the reports were that there were 5 to 6 attackers, and that I think resolves to one attacker who was being witnessed in multiple spots, and that leads to the confusion. It's one reason I use the razor. You often go from 5 to 6 attackers now down to 1. He was shot and killed by police, not before causing a lot of harm. He's a native-born Austrian. He has sympathies with ISIS. He was caught trying to go to Syria to join ISIS and was actually in prison, but then released from jail. He's been under monitoring. It's this kind of, there's a social media where he declared the bayat, and the bayat is the oath of allegiance you give to, I don't know who the new so-called caliph is of ISIS, but you give your allegiance to the leader of the group, and that often is a way of establishing a linkage, even though there may be, they may be inspired, or there may be, it's not someone who came from Syria into Austria. That's really important. These are often homegrown local individuals that themselves get radicalized in their local domestic areas. And in Austria, people are like, well, what's ISIS doing in Austria? Austria has a large Albanian and Macedonian population. That brings in a Muslim population. But let's be clear here. This individual does not have strong ties to the religious community. A lot of these ISIS supporters are what I would call more street-level criminals, that sort of the ultra-violent, maybe a passing interest in religion, but they're not religious scholars, and they basically latch on to this nihilistic, violent ideology. And in fact, there were several Turkish Muslims that were there during the attack. There's some stories on them. I think 2 of them are MMA fighters. They were actually taking the wounded out of harm's way under fire. This may have also led to the belief that there were multiple attackers, because there's video floating around and it's unclear, but these 3 actually were helping people escape from the fire. So I have a feeling there was some speculation early on that, given that this is November, and 5 years ago in November 15th, I think, in Paris, you have the Bataclan attacks. That was a complex attack by a team of 5 or 6 ISIS fighters, killed 100 to 200 people, multiple attacks at a sports arena, the Bataclan Theater, a couple of restaurants, multiple areas at once. I don't think that there was some speculation that this attack may have been a homage or an anniversary of that, but it was moved forward as the lockdown order came in. It's possible, but I think the big difference is this does not appear to be a cell conducting a complex attack. It looks to be what we in the US would call a mass shooter, an active shooting event. Single individual, armed, going out and causing havoc. So that's kind of where we're at. I think I don't see a huge increased risk of ISIS in Europe, but these events are going to continue to happen. This is what clandestine terrorism looks like. ISIS right now, when it comes to risk, northern Iraq, Syria, borders of Uganda, Mali, they're fighting active insurgencies there. ISIS is alive and well in these areas in an insurgent model. And if you go up on the YouTube, we've got these links where I did to the Maritime Academy. I gave what's the difference between clandestine terrorism, insurgencies, and emerging state actors. ISIS is operating as an insurgency, Afghanistan as well, many of these countries. But in Europe, it's going to be clandestine terrorism, individual attacks here and there by people who have no local support and have to basically hide from the population as well from the authorities. So let me pause here and see if there are any more questions by people. Just foreign affairs, national security, as I've always said, the world continues even as we do our elections and do that. Check to see if there's any questions on the election or foreign affairs. Okay, so let me. There was, Jan's pointing out there was a, and this is a good thing from a motivation standpoint. Jan's talking about there was a terrorist attack in France that was the knife killing of a teacher who had shared cartoons of the prophet in his class, and that has caused a huge sort of worldwide backlash, in part because President Macron came down very hard on Islam and Muslims in the country. That provoked a backlash worldwide, but it's not unified UAE. So there's this attack may be in relation to this sort of cartoon depictions, things like that. It may be related to Bataclan anniversary. It may be something else entirely. Anything new on Armenia and Azerbaijan? Mike, thanks for asking. I wanted to get into that. We're bouncing around a little bit here. Armenia, Azerbaijan, you're talking in the Caucasus, northeast of Turkey, south of Russia, northwest of Iran, really in that spot between the two seas, very rich oil field areas in Azerbaijan. There's been an ethnic enclave. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because my Armenian colleagues are going to hit me because I forgot about it. But there's an enclave in Azerbaijan that is ethnically majority Armenian. It's a holdover from a move Stalin made. They've been fighting over that for weeks. There's been multiple ceasefires. They've all been broken. I don't see yet the kind of consensus for a stable peace there yet. And if you want to follow military affairs, you want to know what conventional warfare looks like, if you want to understand what modern warfare looks like, look at Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan is getting crushed because Armenia is getting crushed because what Azerbaijan has is high-tech drones, high-tech artillery, and the communications ability to use them. This means things like you look at traditional military, you got tanks rolling around and armored personnel carriers and large artillery pieces. That's what Armenia's military forces look like. Would normally be pretty good. Those are sitting duck targets. When you have high precision munitions that are being shot from artillery with drones overhead guiding in the targets, being able to loiter on site for 24 to 72 hours. We've seen drones used extensively in counterinsurgency operations. We use it ourselves in Afghanistan. But this fight right now in Armenia, Azerbaijan is a great example of what conventional warfare is going to look like going forward. We've seen parts of this in Libya, where Turkey came in and just demolished the Russian-backed forces with this drone fleet. Same drone fleets being deployed in Azerbaijan. Turkey right now seems to have the secret sauce of how to combine drone activities and high precision artillery. I'm not saying the US doesn't have the secret sauce, I'm sure we do, but they're using it actively now in regional conflicts to exert influence in Libya, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and I don't think that trades very well. It's very cheap for them to supply drones and this artillery stuff. It's not a traditional proxy war. You got to send in, think about Saudi Arabia intervening in Yemen. They've had to do airstrikes for years. Very little effect, besides humanitarian suffering, not really changing the scope of the battlefield. Here we are in 2 months, and just Azerbaijan is demolishing the Armenian forces that are in the way. Yeah, Mike's asking, seems counterintuitive for Israel to sell drones to Azerbaijan. Yeah, I see Anya's saying is put the name up there. I'm afraid I know the name, but I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Nagorno-Karabakh, but I got that wrong, and now I'm going to have Armenians yelling at me. But that is the province inside Azerbaijan that's being contested. Mike mentioning counterintuitive for Israel to sell drones to Azerbaijan. Thoughts? I don't know. I mean, Israel's an arms dealer. They sell high-tech weaponry to countries they obviously don't see as a threat. Armenia has a long-standing cultural history with Israel, but Azerbaijan is a fairly secular government. Even though it's a Muslim majority country, it's a fairly secular government. It's been doing a lot of modernization, and when you talk modernization and secular, you're going to talk military arms purchases, and Israel is buying into that. Also, you got to think about that Russia's backing Armenia, and so that might have something to do with it. I don't know. I'm not going to try and get in Israel politics every time that happens. Oh, here's the pronunciation: Nagorno-Karabakh. Lifetime pronunciation of hard to pronounce names. Thank you, Anya. So yeah, and Rory's pointing out Azerbaijan is also a large fuel supplier for the region. This is how I see it play out. I've always said that at the end of the day, Armenia is going to have to basically, I think, surrender the ethnic enclave. They're going to have to, it's not even recognized by Armenia. This is an independent, it's the Republic of Artsakh. It's an independent, it's not recognized by anyone, but Armenia certainly supports it, and it's fighting over this. I don't think Armenia can change the strategic calculus that's going on unless one of three things happen. one of which is Russia decides to intervene more forcefully. I don't think Putin's going to play that. They've got spanked around by Turkey twice, and in fact, recently, Russia did an attack on rebels in Turkey's area in Syria, I think to draw Turkey away from Azerbaijan, Armenia. The second is, Armenia does have ballistic missiles, and there's rumors that they got their hands on a nuke in the collapse of the Soviet Union. If they wanted to attack those oil fields, and I'm talking the Bacchus region, strategic, if they wanted to make a strategic attack, they could devastate those oil fields, but that would really escalate it, and I'm not sure they're willing to do that. And the third pressure point the Armenian has is the diaspora. There's more Armenians outside the country than there are inside the country. I think there's 8 million Armenians worldwide. A lot of them are in the US, a lot of them are very wealthy, influential, have a lot of political power. If they're able to leverage that, that would have helped, but with President Trump, not a traditional national security president, not a traditional leverage point on foreign affairs, doesn't seem to want to get involved in much. So I think that anything that comes from that would have to come from a new president. You're talking, even if Biden wins, you're talking January at the earliest. So I think Armenia is going to have to cut the losses here and get a negotiated settlement. So good questions. We're at the top of the hour. Once again, just to summarize, a massive election with virtually, relatively speaking, historically high turnout, almost no violence or instability. Good job, America. Very few voter suppression, mass voter suppression tactics, at least has been reported so far. Again, good job, America. The results, who knows? My prediction, Biden wins 290 or up to 306 electoral votes. He takes Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, possibly flips Georgia. Could be wrong. We're going to know either by tonight or at latest Friday night. And when it comes to continuing instability at recounts, there may be some protest rallies and riots up in the weekend and maybe into next week. Check your local weather conditions. The colder and rainier it is, the less likely that will happen. Remaining and after that, it tapers off. I don't think there's a focus point or the demographic conditions to drive us to the kind of mass instability and violence you might see in Ethiopia, for example. But always a risk of clandestine terrorism. Got to be on the watch for that, and that will continue to manifest over the next 6 to 8 months. So that's the make it up as we go forecast. I will post sources and things like that when I put this on YouTube, but for right now, it's mainly off the top of my head. Please, everyone, be safe. COVID-19 remains a very real threat. Be safe out there. If you have to leave your house, wear a mask. If you don't have to, don't. Otherwise, I'll be watching like everyone else, and you can all tell me how wrong I am when this goes up on YouTube and something else happened than what I forecasted. And if you haven't, obviously check us out on Patreon if you're liking this. Like, follow, share, and go ahead and subscribe on Patreon, www.patreon.com. For myself, I'm Timothy Clancy. This is Bonky, the Emotional Support Donkey. Everyone, be good. Take care. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.